So I'm Brett. I work at Brandfolder. We also are hiring. We're in Denver. We've got a couple open roles. We think about hiring somewhat opportunistically and as well on a as-needed basis. So feel free to check us out. I'll give you a little bit of intro of what we do as part of the talk. I'm here because I was in a Slack channel and Dan was asking for speakers. So thought it would be an interesting idea to come up, see what the Boulder Ruby community is like. The Denver Ruby is not as strong, so it's pretty cool to be here and see as much engagement as there is at this. One more time? Fortunately, he's the one in the room I know.
We encourage you to heckle him back.
Yeah, I'm just trying to be supportive.
Thanks.
Giving a talk here.
One thing I should mention about my talk is part of this is an exploration of what we're doing, and I think we're doing quite well at Brandfolder. If people have questions, this is more of the idea of how we're doing things, and it's maybe not as much in detail, but feel free to interrupt and ask. I'd love any questions throughout the whole thing, just because, like, you guys were talking about Circle CI, and we use that in different ways, but I'm not necessarily going to go into the specifics of what we're doing there, but I could if people are interested. So, yeah. So I'm here to talk about how we deliver software at Brandfolder. So to start, really quickly, a little bit of what, oh no.
Oh.
Where's my, cool, got it back.
Actually, you can click the, well, maybe you don't want to do that, but if you click, like, there's like a little hide link that'll hide that little pop-up.
I was waiting.
And it just crashes.
I'm good at getting them back now. So, like I said, I'm kind of going through what we do as a process. So I'll stop for some Q&A and realistically some feedback from other people with experience of where some of this goes south as we continue to evaluate our process. And then given that we are at a developer meetup, I do have code to show and talk about a project that I feel like is appropriate if we have time. So kind of a little bit about what Brandfolder is. We are in a space called digital asset management, which is cloud storage for brands. If we think about some of the cloud storage that exists today, it's a lot less accessible or distributable than some marketing or sales in particular teams need. So we're taking more and more content, sharing it with more and more people globally within and outside of companies. A cool couple use cases that I like to highlight are if you're a brewery and you have really strong in-house creative that's producing great content, but none of the people that use that work for you. They're distributors around the country. How do you distribute that to them? And so Brandfolder gives access controls and availability windows and all of that stuff so they can roll it out to an entire force of distributors that are going to then use those sell sheets and sell them. Another good example being someone like TripAdvisor, who needs hotels to actually throw their logo of TripAdvisor on the hotel. How do you distribute that content? You can build that on your site. They use Brandfolder. And that's just a great, easy way for anyone that hasn't used it before to go get a logo. So there's some cool, I got this from our sales deck, so they look better than anything I would ever make. And there's a lot of words on them. The cool spot that we've gotten to is that we have become, over the last couple of years, the central source of truth for brands' assets overall. They want everything to be accurate in there, the source of truth, and available from there. So if we think about different platforms in the stack, it's how do I get the things from Brandfolder available over there? And then integrated with more and more data sources so that we can pull content in. So that's a little bit about kind of the position that we sit in and some of the opportunities that exist for us. So I think before we talk about what our process is, I was going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we're facing and what's encouraging us to look at what our process is, what's working, and what we should focus on. So I'm highlighting 3 challenges, although we have probably significantly more than that. But one is scale. We went into the year saying we could serve enterprises, but we didn't necessarily have a ton of them, and we didn't have their faith that it would work. So we spent the end of last year, beginning of this year, really beefing up that story. And some of it was functionality, but some of it was, our story to sell. And that's worked. So we've seen a bunch of changes across what we would consider scale this year already, and we're seeing more leading into next year. We've got 3.5 times growth in the content that we're hosting this year. So from the beginning of the year to now, and that'll continue to go up because we've got a lot more time left in the year. Our team size has grown 3x. We've gone from millions to billions of client interactions. And then while we've seen a 20% increase in customer base, they're creating 180% more content. So the engagement with our platform and our product is growing tremendously and giving us that fortunate opportunity to think about things that scale more. And then security. As we go more and more enterprise, the logical ask is, what are we doing from a security standpoint? So how do we continue to do what we're doing, but beef up our security in tandem with that? So we've done things like SOC, GDPR, and more invasive pen testing, security scanning, all of those things. I think that these things should be themes about, as we're considering our process, how are we doing all of this and meeting these needs and continuing to grow them. And then the last one is maintaining velocity. So as we've thought about our product, I think we're in a really interesting position because if we look at the competitive landscape of who we compete against, we see a number of players that are what they would consider startups, a couple very old brands that have been there for a while. But looking across all of it, we appear to have the greatest velocity of all. And so an advantage of being small is that you can have a high velocity a lot easier, especially if you have less legacy clients. But if we're already moving faster than anyone in the space right now, the question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we just maintain that? So as we grow our team, it's not how do we move faster, it's just how do we continue to do that and add and complement the team so that that works while meeting those other concerns. So some cool things about our velocity, we're doing 15 or more deploys a day. We do security checks on every commit. We've got 82% code coverage. And then my big stance is I believe that we're winning in our space when we're building features upon features. And that's something that we've seen a lot of struggle of our competitors to do. And so building experiences on top of discrete features. So those are kind of the underlying challenges that I think that we're faced with going through this year and then kind of into next. So where that comes out is in a set of practices that we have today. And I think a set of practices that should be malleable to evolve as our needs and demands change. So we've distilled these into 5 things. I just counted. And it starts with us for seeking feedback early. So I think that I would assume most of us in the room, especially those from GitHub, are really comfortable with the idea of code reviews and where those fit into our process. I think that's a really... This is where the feedback comes in. So I think code reviews are a pretty obvious one. There's obviously a number of thoughts on code reviews, but we as a team kind of distill the idea that code reviews are not intended to be a gatekeeper and not a bug catcher. So we really don't ask that of it. And we try and build automated process in our development flow to do those things for us, and then use code reviews for things that are up-leveling our team overall. And I think that's somewhat widely recognized, but something that I think we've found a great way to continue iterating on. So we have, I would say, decent test coverage, could always be better. That's a conscious thought and an encouragement in PRs, but we get coverage off of those. We do a bunch of static code analysis with linting and style checking and security checks and things like that. We've done some interesting things where when running migrations, there's a huge checklist of things that you need to do. So we're starting to get into a process of like interrupting the process and saying, okay, this one's special. Have we gone through our checklist? Are we meeting the needs of releasing a migration? Yeah, so feedback early for us is really big. There was an interesting article that actually Steve works at Brandfolder had shared that we're starting to think about, and it's time to first set of eyes on a review. Was the whole conversation of this. And when that article was talking about 4 hours being like a good mark of you should get reviews in under 4 hours, and we're aiming for significantly less than that. If we're doing 15 deploys a day and we don't even have 15 people, that means we've got to have a lot faster cycle time than that. Yeah.
Just curious, do you know how many, like in your, when you open up your PRs, right? Like how many lines of code are changing in those PRs? Do you guys have like a rough number of where you guys are gonna?
They vary quite a bit. We'll talk a little bit more on another slide about how, like, what releasing dark code, but effectively we try and keep them as small and digestible as possible, and very, very, very iterative.
Okay. So you say code review is not intended to be a gatekeeper. How do you do SOC 2?
Because we've got those processes built into our pipeline.
That's interesting.
We've got a lot of automated processes around security checking and all of that stuff too. But I could probably talk for a little while on that, but our SOC 2 process, our controls are built around using GitHub as our source of truth, our release mechanism, our security checks. Like, our SOC 2 person was great to work with in terms of how do we fit our controls around the process that we have today that's working really well for us. And so I've spoken with a few other people about SOC 2 and how they've like taken something that's worked and then completely turned it over and said, well, it says release process and control change management, and like, let's start putting these things in place. And we've really aimed not to do that. So our SOC 2 audit, last one, was opening up GitHub, checking through all the PRs, not all, there's way too many, but like individual PRs, clicking on them, looking at the little check marks to say that it passed and that we're actually complying with our merge process procedures.
And that didn't include requiring a code review.
It does require a code review.
Oh, it does.
So our code review.
Because you said it wasn't a gatekeeper.
We aim for it not to block things into multi-day processes.
Gotcha.
So if we decrease the burden of the code reviewer, they can perform those code reviews faster. Yeah, and if we keep the code reviews small enough, they can get done quicker. And we see that as a team. If someone drops a huge chunk of code, like, you're begging.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic.
We're crazy over here. So I think the next piece is launching dark code. So the tagline here of just controlling the release process. We'll have projects that span months, but ultimately, if we can break that up into really iterable chunks, that's how we've been able to do that successfully. So we've got a bunch of examples across our team of people releasing code into production, testing it on their own, making sure it works, doing some whatever iteration they need, maybe bug fixes, but not negatively impacting the customer experience, which is the core of what we have to do as a SaaS product. I mean, I would say most software should not negatively impact the customer experience, but that's not always true. So we use a bunch of different mechanisms for it with feature flippers, URL parameters triggering something, asynchronous tasks. We've had things that we will fire and attempt before any user interaction enters the flow or any feedback is given back to the user. So it's really, we found some really interesting ways to kind of start hitting this code well before the feature's released in a bunch of different ways.
What's asynchronous task mean here?
So let's imagine we wanted to perform some operation on a thing, and we wanted to exercise that code outside of any impact foreseeable on the user. If we fire that off into a task, we can say, let's go do this thing, see how it works, and then maybe pull that into the actual user's request flow. Or maybe not, maybe it stays asynchronous, but that's a way to exercise that code without actually having a possibly negative effect on the user. And so we've done that in a number of different ways, but the little bullets down at the bottom, deploying and releasing don't have to be the same. We can test in production, progressive rollouts, and then the big one that's always talked about is just kill switches. So if something goes wrong, how do you stop it? So then the next piece for us that's really big, that is somewhat of a difference that I've seen at Brandfolder than other places that I've been, is tight feedback loops. It's easiest for us as engineers to fix problems if we know about them sooner. So the question that we continue to ask as a team is, how do we find out sooner and sooner about those problems? we've got a few things that we do. One is piping errors into a channel in Slack so that we can see those come in when a deploy hits. If a new error comes in, like that's fairly obvious, but being on top of that and accountability as a team, supporting one another of, hey, I saw this and I know you did a deploy, like let's check and make sure if it's worth just fixing that really quick. We've got, and this is new for me in the SaaS space because I was not in this before, but we have an incredible customer support team who has a great relationship with customers. So in the B2C space, that was not true for me. And those relationships were sadly really horrible. But here, when something goes out and if there is a problem, there's usually some quick feedback, and that team is excited to let us know so that we can fix it. And then the really weird part of it all is the customer is sometimes happier. Obviously, we don't want to abuse that, but when the customer notices the problem and you fix it in a half hour, they're pretty elated about that fact. So that's worked pretty well for us. Our sales team, which seems to be different than some of our competitors, demos the product live, which has been great because they're the most consistent users of the product of anyone I've ever seen. And if something changes, even a timing thing, they're very painfully aware. So we get good feedback there too. And then of course, non-production test environments. So the next piece, I think, is probably one of the most important. And I'll kind of touch on one of these things later, but we believe that most of our engineers are product engineers. They're going to act on behalf of the end user. And so what this means is that they're really owning this feature. They're owning the requirements. They're owning the releases of their code, owning getting their own code reviews. They own documentation, everything. And that empowerment there gives a certain degree of significance to what they're doing. So if they ship something that has a problem, they feel personally responsible for fixing that problem. And we've seen that time and time again of people are deploying things, noticing something's up, and really attentive and responsive to the fact that they can fix it. They also get a win in their hat, which is, you don't want bugs, but feels good to fix them. So this one's really huge for us, is just that ownership. And I've seen a number of times where that gets really confusing. And in different organizations, it's not clear who's owning that, and the ownership doesn't fall on the developer, or they're not deploying something, so things are tossed over a wall. And we're specifically trying to avoid that as much as possible. And then the last piece is, I think that's the last one, yeah, is observability. So understanding how our features are working. This is a fairly big topic and covers a lot of different areas, but we're looking at our features from usage, their own dashboards, telemetry, error reporting. We've got some cool systems that we tag with when a feature's used so that you can search with all the errors or events or occurrences with that feature in play. So just giving us visibility into people curating what a feature looks like in production. So thinking about what those things are, I think we've got a few requirements that we place upon our team and the way that we both hire and have people work within the team. So I kind of mentioned product engineers before, but I do believe that at least at our current manifestation of this process, it requires that all the people on the team act as product engineers. So they care about the product and they have an opinion of what that product will look like. We're not necessarily giving product requirements to people on the team. The ask is go get them if you need them, or just start working and be adaptable to change. And that's been a great process for us, but also requires very heavily number two. And so we have the benefit of very, very decisive product managers. Our product managers oftentimes have thought through a product, what it might look like in different forms, so that when asked a question, they are, if not immediate, like within half a day, giving a very significant concrete answer, which has allowed our engineers to go build, try, do, ask one-off questions here and there, gather requirements, whatever their process needs to be on an individual basis, and a basis that will work for the team that's assembled to successfully complete that project, and then use product managers whenever they need. And then we touched on that expectation of ownership. So organizationally kind of setting that out of the gate, saying, you will be an owner, we will defer to you, this is your thing, I think sets a lot of impetus on them feeling and embracing and succeeding in that space, which is, again, something that I've seen other places don't do as well, where there's someone ultimately responsible for that thing. Bless you. And then our team's super collaborative. So we're doing a lot. We're shipping a lot of features. We're pushing a lot and creating some bugs. We as a team have to rally around and help solve each other's problems. And that's a big kind of manifesto as our team, is that we solve problems if they're not ours. We work together as a team and we build everything up together. And then kind of going with shipping darkly, we're very iterative in our mentality. And I think the important thing there is not just iterative in code and not just iterative in features, but iterative in our process. And so that's kind of one of the pieces of what I'm talking about is we need to constantly evaluate our process, see how it needs to change. When we add SOC 2, how are we meeting those needs? How are we up-leveling ourselves in terms of security or whatever those things are? But the really interesting and challenging part of this iterative mentality is that because we have so much we need to do, one of the statements that we make in iteration is, let's try and get it to a good enough place. Not like necessarily that traditional MVP thing, but we need to be confident enough with everything that we ship that we could just leave for a little while because something might come up. And that's rather than leaving just horrible code sitting there because we abandoned a feature part way that we were shipping in chunks. Like, we need everything that we have to be at least remotely capable of sitting wherever it is for some amount of time. And we've seen that as a super important thing for us too. And then last is just openness to change, both as individuals, as developers, as a team, and then really more than anything, an evolution of the process. So I think that brings me to what we are watching for. Because if we're iterative and if we are open to change, I think the question is, what constitutes need to change? And this, especially this section, I guess, would be where I'm curious from other people's perspective that have maybe done some of this, seen it break down, things like that. Like, I'd love to add more to this list in particular. But this is a pretty rough list, and I think it's been working and we've been evolving the process. But obviously team feedback is super important. We have department KPIs and things like that around overall error rates of our platform, uptime and availability, and then looking at what our deliverables are. All of those are reported to the board. And then bottlenecks, we kind of talked about that time to first eyes for code reviews, and then understanding what role requirements and comps fit into our process and how much they are or are not bottlenecking, and adapting that process to make sure that that's not happening. So I'm curious from anyone else if I'm missing things, if people have had experience with some of these, and what things people have tripped on or problems they've had. Nobody? This works flawlessly?
Let me ask a question. So
Yeah.
Time to first eyes, that doesn't mean time to review, because that means there's more than one pair of eyes on it.
We only require one right now.
Okay,
So if we can,
it's a good phrasing.
yeah, we're not opposed to getting more than one. And like, we kind of, with that ownership piece, if you're nervous about it at all, or if you want thoughts, like, our team gets more plenty of times. It's just a personal judgment, and a personal judgment of how many sets of eyes you want. And then I think tying into our iterative process, when we were struggling, or we had one, frankly, it was just one migration that had a missing, I forgot, we forgot to put the word concurrently on something. Fortunately, it wasn't a large table, but that was a not acceptable problem. We changed the process to make sure that administration or administrator role in GitHub is the one that's going to click that button. And so migrations are actually not merged any longer by developers, but that's our process.
Yeah, I know it's such a silly thing. I'm going to ask more questions about it. Because I know I have problems with it. I mean, at my company, where it's like, hey, well, let's pull requests, no one's reviewing them. It's like, is it just people check the Slack room and see it, or people get assigned to it? Like, how do you actually make sure somebody looks?
People have to advocate for their own.
Okay.
There's a lot you can install. Like, right in Slack, it's like called pull reminders.
Yeah.
Set a frequency.
Does that let you know of the ones that are requested of you?
You can set a specific list of people or like a team.
Cool.
did that yesterday.
That I didn't know that one
There's
existed.
certain
That's
levels of
great.
aggression you can take.
No, that's awesome. Because if we're
There- you know those shock bracelets?
because that's one of the challenges, right? Is if we're pushing so many commits and deploying so many things, GitHub is frankly too noisy that I rely, like me personally, I don't know how many of the people on the team, but I rely on people reaching out to me, which is, I think, an issue in this process.
Also, just I should mention with the code reviews in our system, going back to what we talked about, not necessarily like being more like bug fixers or the linters. Like when we ask people to CR, it's actually like not as big of a burden as I've experienced in other organizations where it's like, oh my God, this is 2 hours. Like screw this person, because we have all these other processes and mechanisms in place to catch if there's an error in the bug. I can put a PR in front of Steve when in my first commit. I know there's 4 more coming later because I'm going to iterate on it. But I'm not asking Steve to like, hey, can you double check my spelling, catch my errors? It's like, is my architecture right? Is the general feeling in the direction I'm about to go with this? Is this okay? I might ask for a follow-up review of like, okay, I took our feedback for like what you said, and I want more stuff. Now it's like the final review, but I'm not asking him to go through like line by line and like check like, oh my God, the white space is messed up. You're using like the wrong linting here, or like stuff. It's like, I'm going to use this pattern for this problem because I think it's going to fit and it'll be extensible in the future. Do you agree? And like, that's actually like a pretty quick yes or no for the most part. And once you have like buy-in on that approach, the rest of the CR becomes like a pretty like not meaningless, but like easier to finish thing if you have all of these other mechanisms in place to catch the other things we don't expect humans to do. Because frankly, like Circle CI running our test suite is way better at catching errors than me spotting the missing comma. Like,
Just curious, like when you build those PRs and stuff, are the commits very atomic? So it's like implementation and spec, and kind of nicely.
I squash everything. Like mine is always one commit. Steve will write 30.
Do I owe you $20 now for trolling him?
Oh my God!
No one else in the company squashes like I do. I'm an outlier, but like it varies because I don't actually like. We have the PR set up that they'll squash automatically when they go into master anyway. So like technically it doesn't matter, just for my own sanity. Like I'm not just like committing.
It helps reviewers.
Certain things.
So if you use something like that, like how does anybody like new to the team learn in history, right? Because trying to read and try to understand how the architecture, how the system got built, there's no breadcrumbs. You're giving nothing to the documentation.
Well, if you have like
But-
30,000 commit,
I guess, can you explain that part a little bit more?
See his talk.
Sorry, I'm very passionate about
Amongst other things.
and a few people know that I care a lot and I speak a lot about this. But
Don't you let your commits?
so
Don't get sidetracked.
thanks for the volley. No, I have a gem. It's called GitCop, and it actually lints, and we actually wire that into our CI process. And so we keep our commits so that they're very atomic, very small. This ties into my question, like your code review, right? Making sure the lines of change are kind of small so you can easily review the code and get it approved quickly. So kind of, to your point, right? We have all the linters and other checks in there too, because we want to be talking at an architectural level when we're doing these code reviews. But the other key thing, though, is this is a very, very, very powerful tool. So if you can keep your commits atomic, your implementation, your spec, you keep just those units of change. What's really nice about that is it's very easy to review because as you kind of go through the commits in your PR, you can kind of read them like a book. Each commit builds upon another. It's telling a story.
Yeah.
And what's really valuable about that is in terms of like reviewing, it's really easy to review and get that rebased onto master, rebased. But it also keeps your Git history clean because what's really important is when somebody comes onto your team and they want to go and they want to get up to speed on the architecture, and maybe you're too busy like pairing with somebody, or you just don't have the chance to like talk to them. If you can have your previous self recorded historically in the Git commit, and it's a good Git commit message that explains the what and why, and maybe even has like benchmarks and other reasons in there for why this change was put, I don't have to tap you on the shoulder and break you out of your development flow. Like if you're in the heat of things, I can have this conversation with the past you. You've solved it for me, and then I can go on and I can actually fix the bug or add the new feature. And that's hugely empowering for the team. So kind of to your point, to your talk, right? Like that's what you want on your team, a highly functioning team. You want to be able to empower your developers to make the changes that they need to do.
Is that not manifested through comments, tests, and the PR itself, or the commits with the PR?
It is, but it's also just thinking in terms of time. Like, 6 months from now, you're going to be a different engineer. You're going to have a different team as you grow and evolve. And if you need to go back and you want to leverage all the search tools and the grepping that you could do in a Git history, right? It's nice to be able to have clean commits to actually go back and understand what that is, why that change happened. So you can make those architectural decisions or make the changes that you need to do as an individual engineer.
I guess my question being, if we're iterative about our changes overall, are we not getting some of the benefits of what you described because the change sets are so small themselves?
Like the PR as a whole.
The tricky part is that the pull request, this is coming from someone who works at GitHub, is not a great place to express information that's persisted over the long term because it's not discoverable.
Right.
So I mean, I always make the argument that you should do atomic commits because you're basically like leaving breadcrumbs for like other people.
Yeah.
What I've discovered, and I used to make the argument that you should it matters more when you're in bigger teams. What I've realized is that I'm actually just leaving clues for myself.
Yeah.
Like even if I'm on a team of one, I'm leaving clues so that like 6 months from now, I know what the fuck I was thinking. It's like, and those clues don't if you're writing them in pull requests, they only go so far. So,
Sorry, I don't use all this language. When you say atomic commit, do you mean you don't commit, you just commit one file at a time, or you don't commit two features together?
One thought at a time.
Yeah, one thought. So usually, like, your
However
language
many
of
lines it
choice.
takes to express that change.
smallest change that you might have like a failing test and then the code that makes the test pass. That is it. Like the minimum amount of code.
Yes.
There's some systems that are actually like, what is it? Git commit. It's like commit or revert or something like that. It's one of the ones that you mentioned. You write a test and you write code, and if the test doesn't pass, it just reverts it.
Yeah,
I know about that one.
Yeah.
It's because you can like hit the button and you can walk away for lunch and you know if it breaks something, like it got rolled back automatically and you didn't have to worry about it.
Yeah.
I know it's the biggest.
but that also ties into like bisecting and so forth, right? Like if you have a bad employee, be able to
So-
easily roll back.
So bisecting is a great example. So like if you want to know exactly where something broke, like I did bisect something in Rails lately, like a few weeks ago, and like we found the exact commit that it broke, and because the people who commit to Rails use atomic commits, we were able to like know exactly the problem that it was, versus if it was a squash commit, I would have had to pull apart that entire pull request, line by line, and actually probably break it up into commits and then bisect those commits.
Yeah, and that's where I'm going with this. It's like on your team, like it brings a sense of empowerment, but also joy. It's nice to work in a code base like that because I'm totally empowered to debug this, fix it, and get back to work. And with the squashes, that's why it terrifies me, is that that's just a bundle. It's like a whole bundle of spaghetti, and I have to like pull my hair out and try to understand where the problem is, where the needle in the haystack is, and I can't do my job that way. So.
I think because it sounds like your commits and pull requests and squash things are small. If you're bisecting, it's still going to work just fine. You're like,
It works
I'm looking
pretty
at less than
decent,
100 lines.
There's been like
It's not that
maybe 1 or 2 times in 4 years that like I've been burned where I had to spend an extra hour because the bisect only got me so far, and then it's like, all right, well, which of these 10 files have been changed, right?
I think that started to change a lot with dark code. So while it makes sense what you're saying about atomic commits and committing on a per file basis, if we're building out that file, shipping it because it's high risk, or we want to just get it out there and maybe have some code paths hit it, that is almost that atomic commit too, I think. In some ways, I understand that's not as atomic as what you're talking about, but a lot of times those change sets will be, I want, the feedback on this pattern. I'm going to put it somewhere. We'll build something that'll start using it, but that's in prod and not a big deal. It's an interesting thought that you have. Like, I mean, there's a lot of sense behind that.
Yeah. And so, sorry, I didn't mean to also derail.
No. I mean, ultimately, that's what I'm curious about, is how people have seen this work, and like what we should watch out for.
How many people are in your team?
12.
I got a two-part question. Can you go a little bit more in depth on what you mean by a product engineer versus a regular engineer, and how do you sort of balance or reconcile, whatever the word is, with quarterly and annual deliverable versus what's on your company roadmap?
Yeah, so starting with the first one. Yeah, so what's a product engineer and a regular engineer? The ask and why the term product engineer is fairly important to us is because they are thinking about the product from the user's perspective. I have enjoyed at times thinking about the engineering problem that I'm solving in the past, as well as worked with plenty of people that are focused on the technical side without the implications on the user. And so as people are running with these things, these projects that they're working on, and given that our code base is what it is right now, and asking them to think about the user and weigh that in as they're delivering software as it pertains to a feature is, I think, the definition that we've been using. It's really adding weight to the significance of what they need to think about when they're releasing. And adding on that the ownership of defining what that product is going to look like and what released means.
Can I also add to that?
Yeah.
From a product engineering standpoint versus an engineer, that's like the world is a lot more gray than these shades of black and white. But if an engineer is thinking about like, well, I can make this thing 10x as fast, and I can fit the specs, and I can make the thing work and do the job, versus a product engineer is saying like, I have to build those requirements, or if I even have requirements in the scope of this app, this service, to meet the need for this user who's struggling with this specific problem. And not only just do that, but we also implicitly add the weight of, if you were to build on that feature again later, what decisions would you make now versus like you made the tightest coupled, like fastest thing on the internet, but like you can't change it later, right? Those are kind of like, it's like a slightly different frame of thinking around the engineering problem than it is of like, it's not necessarily two different people. They can be one and the same, but you have to change the frame and mindset. You start architecting and coding a solution.
I have a comment and a question.
Yeah.
I'm sort of a product guy on a small app. And so like my developers, like we had something that syncs, like sync Stripe subscription IDs or something, or Stripe plans, right? So there's like a sync method. So he goes into the model and he solves the sync method and he's like, done. He pushes it. So what I do is I always like I like bring up the app in the view and actually test it in the view and see like, does the drop down actually sync, you know? And a lot of times I catch things in the view, like that one, like when you delete something in Stripe, it wasn't deleting it in our database or something wasn't happening and you didn't really see it in the code. And so like, I always want my engineers to like, right before they push it, to actually go in like a user and look at the view like a user. And it's crazy, like you guys, my background's not engineering, but I code. So but it's weird that the engineers like solve it in the model, but don't actually log in and act like a user.
Because that's when you frame it in the product as a whole and you're asking like,
Yeah.
our features interact with other features. They're not isolated, disparate things and buttons that you click in the app. Eventually they play on each other.
Yeah, but do people actually do that is my question. Do you guys go in the view and look at it?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Is that required?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
Do
so
your engineers think that like someone else, maybe because you do it, they don't? That's what I found at companies is that if you have someone that's clicking around the view, you feel like less incentive to do it.
Okay.
yeah.
I know that
Goes back to
like,
that sense of ownership.
like I'm like at GitHub, when I write a feature, I'm the last person that does quality before it goes into product. So it better be right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
like if I had a product manager clicking through it, I'd probably be a little less careful.
Yeah.
So maybe you stop doing it and things start breaking.
And
Yeah.
so we've implemented a light process for when that happens and someone hasn't done it, and we have to, because we can roll things back, and we have to do that. There's a little write-up of what happened and why, because that, if you're the last person that's touching it before it goes to prod, like and then also after it goes to prod, like what broke down in the process and how do we change? And if that list of, we have all these events where we keep having to roll back, and how long was it between the deploy and the rollback? That all that information is contained within the little write-up of something went wrong. But that's an acknowledgement of that product engineer to say, that didn't work, and I need to do something different next time. I don't know if that.
One thing I was curious is you've talked a lot about like process and getting these things down, like for instance, like your migrations and so forth, which is fantastic. But curious, like, is there any effort like on automation and stuff? Like instead of trying to put it into a process and these checklists you have to do manually, and any discussion on the team or taking that and incorporating that and like, oh, we should add some tooling around this or some additional automation so there's not so much burden on having to go through those checklists. Just kind of curious if there's been a bit of a debate.
So working towards that in some different ways. The checklist only applies when a migration is there. So it's not an overall GitHub template that's applied to every commit. It's just on a migration. But I think there's more we can do around making sure that those things are met in an automated sense. I think it's just a matter of time and like having the time and interest coincide for us to get there. But it's something I'm super interested in doing.
So you were asking for recommendations. There's a gem for that.
Is there?
So it's strong migrations.
Cool.
And at least prevents you from totally shooting yourself in the foot.
Okay. Could one of you two write that down? Thanks.
It's not for everyone, but it has some pretty good.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it mainly tries to prevent you from doing. Is blocking.
And so because migrations are frequent, but not too frequent, it's been a reasonable answer for us to just say the process slows down for this one. Like it's worth slowing it down because you can't have that. But I'm really interested to look at strong migrations.
You had a second question.
Yeah, your other question.
Again, how do you balance your deliverables?
So we do include engineering and security, and I guess scale fits into engineering things in our deliverables. That is a big piece of it. So that fits into the roadmap. It's less planned out because that stuff's evolving a little bit more for us. Whereas we kind of have an idea in the head of the product of what this will look like. So I think more of what I mean by those deliverables are we actually hitting our quarters and what we set out to do? Because if we aren't, that is an indicator that something's not working. We think we should be able to do X amount of work in some amount of time, and it's actually taking more. Or we've not attended to the things that need to, like scale or security or whatever those things are, and we've seen some things come up and we need to catch up. So deferring product work because of that. So fortunately, we haven't had that situation happen, but it's something that we are keeping a pulse on of like, we had a couple quarters where we were pushing everything right at the end. So we evaluated what does it look like to change our process so that everything doesn't deliver like the day before the quarter and like all the on switches go and there's so much change in the system because that's horrible.
Our engineering team actually now does apply, like, it's not, we separated our quarters for the deliverables on our own schedule. And it doesn't actually affect like the quarters of the company at large, like the sales quarters. But to Brett's point, we had 1 month where we shipped like 4 major things all at like the last day, and the sales team's trying to deliver features or delivers like numbers and close deals. We're just like causing disruption and chaos with new things, like literally features popping up on a demo that like a sales rep has never seen before. Sometimes they nail it, and sometimes they just don't know what it does. But so we started planning our quarters on offsets. So our quarter technically starts in the middle of the normal company quarter for our engineering deliverables, and then it ends in the middle of the next quarter. And so, yes, it's hard to plan things so that like everything ends in the middle of the quarter. But if you just do it that way in your head when you're planning, you don't even technically need, like the organization at large doesn't even care, because at the end of the day, you're saying like, well, you're going to get these things this quarter. Do they care if it came on the last of the day or the middle? Right? Like you deliver those things that quarter. And that's kind of how we avoided that situation.
You had your hand up much earlier. I don't know if we missed something.
Sidetracked us and it's gone.
Yeah, what's up?
I got a quick one. So what's the advantage of using your Dart code and pushing directly into production and then not releasing over like a staging environment?
So we still do use a staging environment, and that's a great place to test for our team. But that Dart code allows us to test things a bit more with more load and scale and different conditions that we wouldn't be able to replicate as easily on the staging environment, where it's closer to, I mean, it's bigger than local, but it's under the conditions that you're putting it through.
Yeah, I misunderstood.
Yeah.
We're skipping stage.
Not everything has to go there, though. I should mention that. It's an optional thing.
Oh.
Anything else? Well, I think we're at time, so I'm not going to go into the code part, but I think the last part I would just mention is what's been an interesting thought process for me is that as engineers, we like to scrutinize and think about code and how that grows and manifests, but I've gotten really interested as of late into how we apply those same thought processes and iterative mentality to our team's process. And like, obviously we have a lot of well-defined processes to follow in the industry, but we're making it fit for what our team needs and what's seeming to work.
There's no like time here, so if you can go into the code a little bit, I think most people would be okay with that. Feel free to say no, but I think
Feel free to cut into my time.
I mean, I'm happy
You
to.
can show us your commit log.
Yeah.
Watch the first one I open is 1,000 lines.
interaction with squash 30 minutes right before your eyes.
If you could pull up your master and squash everything, your whole history to one commit. And go off the road.
Yes, rewrite history, put me as the author. This is a hard group.
Add
I'll go into this project. I picked this one partially because this is a Ruby meetup and not necessarily Rails. So our main application is a Rails app, but this part includes a fair bit of infrastructure as well as some Ruby specific non-Rails code. So it's a feature called SmartCDN. The part that's super interesting to me about it is, one, it's done really well for us as a product and scale. So when I talk from millions to billions of interactions, part of that is via the CDN. And then the other piece is if we give our engineering team or product engineers that empowerment to go do and solve cool problems, like we can get solutions that we never really thought of or dreamed of as part of our product. And so that's kind of what this one is. So I'm assuming at least a good chunk of the room is familiar with what a CDN is. So effectively, I should probably just say it's a content distribution network, so getting content at edges near users. The interesting part about ours and why we call it the SmartCDN is if we think way back to the beginning of the presentation, it was source of truth is Brandfolder. If your assets are in Brandfolder, then you use Brandfolder as a CDN. The same digital rights rules, transformation rules, quality rules all fit within the delivered image over the CDN. And so that's where we land on SmartCDN. A quick example, yeah?
So does that mean like if you use Brandfolder, let's say I have this, like an image that I want used only by a certain subset of maybe people, the CDN respects?
We don't do that yet. We're thinking and talking about some of those ideas, but we don't do that yet.
I'm not sure I understand.
There you go.
Is that me? That was me, I'm sorry.
Do you literally have your own CDN or you're on top of somebody else?
We're on top of someone else.
Okay,
We're
so
not aiming to do that. No.
Okay.
No, we squashed it.
So the core of what this is the logic engine behind what's delivered via that CDN. A good example for us was for Take Your Kids to Work Day last go around. We had all the kids draw the Brandfolder logo. We put that into a GIF, and then we swapped it out as our logo in our Brandfolder, and all of a sudden, all of the pages changed, and our GIF of kids drawn Brandfolder logos was all over our properties. So those are some of the powers of the CDN. The other interesting piece of this that has gone really well, especially on demos, is been tracking for where those links are active. So in our own UI, we're able to show people where that image exists across the internet, which is available from CDN providers via logs and things like that. But we've been told a number of times that that's more information than anyone can see about their images across their CDN providers. So it's been a hugely engaging thing through demos where people are like, oh, that's pretty awesome. It helps like auditing, understanding what's active, and the really cool piece I mentioned a lot earlier was I think our jobs as engineers is to build features upon features and complex workflows that make sense to the user. In this case, we have a CDN as a product. So upload something, you like then power it via the CDN. We have curation tools within Brandfolder, so delete things. If we combine these workflows, if we say when you're deleting, if this thing is on the CDN, let's not do that because that would take it down from all of these properties. That's an experience that we were able to build because we built it on top of two different features. So that's the architecture for it. And kind of walking through some of the pieces. So this is our, yeah. So that is our main application. That's our, it says Ruby, but it's a Rails app. There's a Ruby process in play as part of that application. We do stream content via Go since Ruby, and forgive me, I'm probably the least Ruby experienced person here, but Ruby's not great at allowing us to stream that content, but I'm going to say that lightly. And then delivering it to different CDN providers like Fastly and Cloudflare. So we did not build our own CDN. We don't ever aspire to do something like
proxy?
What?
Did you build your own proxy?
Yeah, yeah. Mostly because of the rules around delivering that content and the origin rules and things like that. So we do log dumping from those providers into GCS. We fire events that trigger, we're in GCP, so Cloud Functions, that produce schemas on the pub sub of all of the CDN events. And then we dump those into cloud storage. We get them into data warehouses and dashboards and things like that for billing visibility stuff. But then the other interesting piece is we showed in the application that we could tell you where your images were. So all of those events flowing through PubSub, we have a consumer listening in a Ruby file process that is consuming all of them and then writing that to our database so that at some interval we'll keep refreshing and giving the users an updated view of where those URLs are being hit. So if we don't see that in our database, then we'll add new ones and then we'll update timestamps. But it's been a cool, like I said, I think a cool architecture for us to throw together to kind of show what if we give engineers the leeway and the product capabilities to define what we could do. One, we can have some pretty good fun with technology, I think, as well as deliver a pretty cool product. So some of the pieces involved there are we're using for some set of reasons that I think would take a little bit longer to explain. We're serializing our messages on PubSub with Proto. And so that's defined. We've got a Proto message going across. And then we actually have just a Ruby process that is going in here, picking up these messages and writing to the database.
Sorry to interrupt. For the blind device, that a little bigger.
Yeah, absolutely.
Some of you might be wondering, like, well, if you're gonna have pub subs shoot straight over to the Rails app, load active record, and then right to the database, like billions of events, doesn't that sound like a terrible idea? I mean, you would be correct. But we found ways around this where you can get, like, maybe it's not the right thing to do. Like, maybe we're crazy if we're just putting this in our actual main Ruby app. But we found ways through a little bit unconventional Rails syntax, diving a little bit under the covers of like, oh, you can create a completely stub version of like any of your models or classes, and then you can go straight into the DB from there. There's no overhead, and it's just like you're streaming straight in. Like, you can do that. I wouldn't. You probably won't find this in the Rails guides, but like, I don't know, it's been working for over a year now.
There's a surprising number of things on GitHub that are architected this exact way.
Yeah,
Literally almost like the exact chart. Yeah, it's surprising that it's cool to see you guys at your scale end up with that.
It was so easy for us to throw that together, and the value that that provides on a demo for us, as well as, frankly, from us as engineers, not having to deal with the, oh crap, this person at X company deleted something and their CDN's broken, can you fix it? Like, that has solved all of that. Because we had one report come in and we were like, we were actually solving that feature, but we haven't delivered it yet. And then so we delivered that and it stopped. So it's been super cool to see how easy that was to do. And also the throughput has jumped dramatically. We have just clicked more processes whenever our pub sub consumer has fallen behind, but we really haven't had any concerns with scale on this.
How the process is spin up independently. We could put an automatic like load balancer to spin them up automatically down, but like right now it's a manual process, but it's fine.
If there's any questions on that, I just thought it'd be some good Ruby code to share. Well, thanks. Appreciate it.